Hey, welcome along. It's Tuesday evening. Good to see you all here. Let me get a drink of water. Good to join you whenever you listen. You might be listening live. You might be listening later on. You might be watching on Facebook. You might be watching on YouTube. Welcome along. So, if you don't know, I'm Richard Moores, Children's Youth and Families Pastor for Southside Uniting Church, which is in Brisbane, in Australia. We might have some international guests, visitors watching. Who knows? Maybe one day when I suddenly become viral on YouTube and everyone's watching back on these things. Wow, that's what Richie was in Australia. So welcome along. So we meet on the south side of Brisbane, and the Yagara and the Turrbal people were the traditional custodians of this land, and so we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And we pray for conciliation between us and the first peoples of this land. So we come together and we talk about each Tuesday night some stuff to do with ministry with young people and the things that that can apply to them. We've spent the last few weeks talking about how we live in a secular age and how we might need to change how we do ministry and how we interact with people for the things that are connecting with them and sparking them off. It's different to how things were in the past. Today I thought we would talk a bit about how we interpret the Bible. Spring out of sermon did a couple of Sundays ago, and we'll draw on some of that material. But before I do that, one of the things we do each week is we have a movie quote. And if you can be the first person to put the movie quote, where the movie comes from, in the box down the bottom. If you're watching this on YouTube and no one's put it, if you can be the first person to put it in, without me saying what it is, no cheating, you can win a prize. Now, last week or the week before, I couldn't remember the previous week. And I know at some stage we had, you can't find in here, this is the war room. And I didn't say where it came from. So that comes from Dr. Strangelove. So if you missed that. If you've been sitting there for a few weeks going, but he never told us, where does that come from? There you go. You can't find it here. It's the war room. It comes from Dr. Strangelove. But that's not the movie quote for today, even though no one got it. We could have had it. Could have jackpotted maybe. No. So the movie quote for today. And I don't think we've had this one before. If we have, you'll just have to forgive my forgetfulness. But I thought might fit in with what we're talking about. So I'll give you two quotes from the movie. Quote number one. He's not the Messiah, he's a naughty boy. Other quote. Only the true Messiah would deny that he was the Messiah. So there you go. He's not the Messiah, he's a naughty boy. And only the true Messiah would deny that he's the Messiah. Where do those quotes come from? If you know, pop it in the box. See if you can beat Kylie. She's probably madly typing away right at this second. So, one of our challenges when we look at the Bible is we all interpret. That you cannot help but interpret the Bible when you read it. And sometimes, sorry, Kylie was just yelling out no. So either she either doesn't know it, or she's grumpy that she might have to type down what the name is. So one of our challenges is that we all interpret the Bible. And part of our struggle with the big discussion areas in the church is that we don't actually just name that we're all interpreting. We all interpret it differently. We all just pretend as if, well, my interpretation is the correct interpretation. And in fact, lots of people I don't interpret the Bible, I just read it. And the truth is, we are not, for the New Testament, first century Jewish Christians. So we don't know that world fully. And so all we can do is interpret. Interpret what does that mean into our world today? What do those words mean? And in fact, when the Bible is translated, the translators interpret what that means. And so they pick the words that they think fits best with how they interpret what the meaning is. So an example that springs to mind out of discussions around same-gender marriage is that in Leviticus it talks about that a man should not sleep with a man, whereas the NIV, because of their point of view, translate that as a man should not have sexual relations with a man. Now they're going, oh, that's what the metaphor means, so we'll put it into... And it's like, well, there's a metaphor there. Maybe it's getting at something slightly different than that. You've interpreted it and becomes a hard statement, as opposed to this is, well, there's some sort of, we're able to read into that a little bit. And so there's this sense of translators interpret, we interpret as we read. And a couple of weeks ago, so we were looking at that the passage of Solomon going to anoint, not Solomon. So we were looking at the passage of Samuel going to anoint David as the next king. And those words of God that people look at the outward appearance, but I look at what is in the heart. And that challenge of how do we see what's in the heart, not just what do we see in the heart of other people, but what do we see in the heart of ourselves? And challenging people to, to think that we actually see what we are taught to look for. So don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's numerous versions of it. But there's a clip of these two teams, a white team and a black team, and usually about 3 on each team. And you're asked, count the number of times that the white team passes the ball. So you're madly sitting up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then at the end, they tell you the number of passes, say 16. Then they say, did you see the gorilla? And of course, about 50% of people go, what? No, there was no gorilla in that clip. There were people passing basketballs. And that rewinds the clip and shows it again. And the gorilla walks through and he does a little dance in the middle, standing in the middle, and then he walks off screen. And you go, how did I miss a gorilla standing? And the ball goes behind the gorilla and in front of the gorilla, and surely I should have seen the gorilla. But I was told to look at the white team and how many times they were passing the ball. And so part of our challenge in life, and I think it was Brian McLaren I heard talking about this, could have been Richard Rohr. It's one of those two. They probably would both talk about it. But that sense that we see what we're told to look for. And that's one of the challenges as we come to look at the Bible. We see what we are told to look for. I think I've used the example before of Brian McLaren of looking at the Bible. And, it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. And apparently when you put together a jigsaw puzzle, you look at the front of the box, picture on the box. I think that's cheating, and you turn the box over and you just put the puzzle together, because that's the true way a jigsaw puzzle should be put together. And Kylie right now is probably shaking her head and will probably put some silly comment about how silly I am to do such a silly thing. But I think that's the proper way of doing a jigsaw puzzle. Anyway, so Brian McLaren says that, we have this picture on the box and we're trying to put our jigsaw puzzle together of who God is. And so we take these passages in the Bible, and sometimes, they're not quite the right colour. And so we just change the colour a bit. No, we'll interpret it this way, because that's really what it means. I'm sure it's meant to be read. Oh, what that means is this. We'll just change the colours a little bit. Then some of the bits are, they're not quite the right shape to fit in where we think they should go. So we just chop a little bit off them. We just ignore that verse. That verse isn't important. We just nip that off. We put it in. And Brian McLaren says, perhaps our problem isn't the pieces themselves, but it's actually the picture on the box. That our picture of God is wrong. And so therefore we're struggling to how we put these pieces together. We actually have to go back to the Bible and the Bible passages and go, I need to just start from, here are these pieces. What image of God do I get from these? And sometimes that's challenging, because that's not the image that we've necessarily grown up with, but we've got to wrestle with, what does this piece mean for our image of God? our picture that we're going to get when we finish this puzzle, as opposed to just what's on the box. And so that struggle of when we come to read the Bible, we've come with these preconceived ideas. I guess when I think back to my youth group days, that sense that what is the Bible? Well, the Bible is the instruction manual for how we are to live. You know, it's like a car has its, and I remember hearing this analogy, a car has its manual and we have the Bible. It instructs us how we are to live our lives. And if that's how we're taught to read the Bible, then we read it in a certain way. And so after I preached the sermon on Samuel anointing David, one person was chatting with me afterwards and talking about that sense that they have a family member who struggles with a God who always seems to be grumpy at them. And when they read the Bible, God always seems to be grumpy. And that's one of the things we can get if we're reading the Bible as this is the instruction manual. Well, I'm not doing that. You know, I've messed up again. I'm failing again. And it was interesting. A few weeks ago, I was at Boys Brigade and sitting in with the juniors, and the juniors were doing their devotions. And the reading was the story of the people wandering in the wilderness, having come out of Egypt through the Exodus. They're in the wilderness and they're complaining. And they want food, and God provides them quail and manna. And the leader who was doing devotions, I imagine, comes from the Bible is the instruction manual to how we are to live. And so what do we get out of that story? Well, we get out of that story that we shouldn't be grumbling. That, you know, God gives us stuff, we shouldn't grumble. You know, what does this story tell us about how we live? We don't grumble. The people of Israel grumbled. That's why they were in the wilderness. We shouldn't grumble. Indeed, we should be grateful thing. But perhaps the Bible is a different. Because the interesting thing is, if we go, the Bible is an instruction manual of how to live. Who is the main character in the Bible? Well, then it must be the human beings. They're all the main people in the Bible, because they're the ones that are showing us what it is to live or not to live the right way. But you can pick up the Bible in quite a different way. So you can pick up the Bible and say, this is a story about who God is and how God interacts with humankind. And it tells us about the God that we follow. And the main character in the Bible is God. He is the one we're to focus on. And if we come from that sense, then the story about the giving of the manna is a story about these people who complained, but God loved them so much that he provided for them. He didn't worry about the complaining. That's all right. Bit annoying. Wish you didn't. But you know what? I'm still going to give you this food. I will provide for you. I was talking with Jock. We're going up, or coming, I think we were coming down Mount Cravat by the time we got onto this part of the conversation about this. And yeah, he sort of mentioned, yes, that sense of if it was the instruction about don't grumble, then God probably just wouldn't have given them anything. Well, don't grumble. Well, you get nothing because you grumbled. Stop it. Bad. No. But instead we have this loving God that goes, no, here. Have. Yes, you're grumbling at me. Discouraging. Disappointing, but let me provide for you. And so we have this story. And so it's quite a different way of reading the Bible. It's coming to it and going, what does this passage tell me about God? As opposed to, what does this passage tell me that I need to do? Which allows us then to go, I can read big chunks of the Bible because I'm not having to go, well, what does this particular verse tell me about who I am and what I need to do? Rather, what does this whole sweeping story tell me about God? And I need to get a big picture, because our God is so big that I can't get it in 2 verses. 2 verses are going to tell me nothing about God. If I've got a chapter, 2 chapters, a whole book, I might get a bit of a glimpse of this God that I follow. And so it's important for us to stop and to ask ourselves, how do we come to the Bible? And yeah, it's that challenge of how do I come, how do others come, and how do we engage in a conversation? And when you're aware of how you're reading and how others are reading, you can sit there and go, I can see why you're going there. And I wouldn't have gone there, but that's all right. You've gone there because this is how. So I could sit there and Boys Brigade and go, it's not what I would have done. But I know why you got there. I understand how you come up to this as the important point, because you're reading this as, well, what does this story tell me about what humanity? Well, humanity grumbling, that's bad. God tells them off a bit. Right, tick, that must be the message. When we understand that, when we get why people are reading it differently to us, then we can engage in conversation about what it means. Because the problem is, if we go into a conversation, this leader and I, and I say, this is about God, it's love. It's like, well, no. I don't get how you're getting there, because obviously these people have done wrong, and this is how I've been taught to read the Bible. Like, I wouldn't say that, but that sense of, the Bible is about how we're to live. So it's not, we can't just ignore this. People doing the wrong thing. This is the key. And if you're talking about, God's love and provision, yeah, that's nice, but the key is this. This is what I've been taught to look at. And so if we don't understand, we're interpreting in different ways, it can seem to one party that the other party is just throwing out. And it can seem to the other party, the other one's just holding on to something that's this tiny, minute thing that's not important. They're missing the big picture. Here's this God of love, and you're focusing on the whinging. No, we're focusing on God. Or, hang on, we're learning not to whinge, and you're just focusing on God's love. No, we need to deal with the problem. And so the two can never have a real conversation with each other, because they're not, opening up that, we're interpreting. And you can do that with any issue. And so we talked a little while ago about same-gender marriage and women in ministry. And that sense of women in ministry, we brought change in because we started to read the Bible differently. And some people have gone down that path and others haven't. And they still read it and go, hang on, this is... If you're going for a fairly literal reading, you end up, hang on, these words I take absolutely seriously. Paul says women must be silent in church, therefore that's what it means. Boom, boom, boom. And unless you actually have that conversation about, okay, this is how you're interpreting, this is how I'm interpreting, and not just this is how I read this passage, but this is the bigger picture of how I interpret. Okay, I start from a place that this, writing of Paul and the Bible is about God. And I come from a place where this writing of Paul is answering problems in a church called Corinth. Or I come from a place where I think God has inspired the words in the Bible. And what you're saying, and these things, are truths into today. And this is about how we behave. You can't have a dialogue unless you go back to where you're starting from. And so it's important for us to stop and to think about, how do I interpret the Bible? What's my starting point? When I pick it up, what do I think I'm reading? Trying to think. Yes. So, and there's a whole heap of thoughts going through my head going, say me. And I'm going, no, that's not important. No, so that's why I keep stopping. I think I've told you this story before, but I remember back in the Upper Hunter, and the assembly had asked for congregations to feedback their view on same-gender marriage, the whole marriage issue, what marriage should be. And so we were preparing the churches in the Upper Hunter to come back with their feedback and to write stuff up. And so we decided, let's do 2 weeks on marriage. One of our congregations was a strongly conservative church. And they'd already written their position statement on what they thought was marriage and a very traditional view of marriage. And so there'd been the first Sunday, which one of our lay preachers had led out there, and it had not gone down well. And so I was leading the second week out there, and I thought, I'm not going to actually touch the marriage issue, because my view is going to be completely different, or fairly different to yours, and that's may skew ministry I have with you in the future. It's going to raise questions that don't need to be raised right now, because you've already done yours. I don't need to shake that up. But rather what I'll decide I'd do would talk a bit about how we interpret the Bible. And some of the stuff we've been talking about. I've developed more since then. Well, it's probably about 7 years ago. So 7, 8 years ago now. Wow, time flies. So I've developed further beyond there. In thinking, probably would have a much better sermon this now than I did then. But yeah, that sense of that we all interpret, and that we need to recognise that we all interpret, and as we understand that we are interpreting the Bible, then we can have conversation about bigger issues, and that we need to be aware of others' interpretations and be open to their interpretation. That there is not one right way of reading the Bible and everyone else is wrong, but that we all interpret. And you do that as a minister, going, right, I need to get you to open up and to be open to other people's interpretations, because you're probably not going to get what you want out of this. So learn to be open. And I remember driving home and having that sense of God saying, you know how you just preached that sermon? And you know how you talked about they need to be open to other points of view and other interpretations? You know that also means that you need to be open and allowing to their interpretation. And then it was like, no, God, that's not the way. This is about them opening up so that they can come to see the truth that I've seen and follow my view. It's not about me accepting them. But it's true. I needed to be reminded that I needed to be open and honest to allow them to interpret the Bible in their way, and to maybe challenge that sometimes, and to cause them to think, but to go, okay, this is how you think. Okay, let's engage in a way that can help you to think through issues in this way, as opposed to, if I just come and go, you've got to interpret it this way, we're interpreting this way, boom, we're never going to be able to talk. So, yeah, we need to be open to other interpretations. So I'm not saying the correct way to read the Bible is that it's a story about God and we need to interpret it as this God of love who is giving. I think that's the better way. I suspect, for me, that's the way that it seems God is. But remember, I'm not God. So I could be wrong. So I need to be open to other people's interpretations. And to hear, well, how do you interpret that passage? How do you read it? Why do you read it like that? Okay. And when you do that, you cause yourself to go, well, why do I read it the way I read it? And you need to think through that process. And then you go, oh, actually, maybe I need to alter my view a bit, or no, actually, I've thought through why I read it that way, and I'm convinced by that argument. So therefore, I'm stronger in my faith that this is what this passage means. So yeah. And so it helps us to ask that question. Why? How do I interpret? Because it helps us to solidify what we believe and to strengthen what we believe. That it's not just, I've got this lovely idea out there, but I believe it because I read it in this way, and this is what the passage is telling me. So let me encourage you to take time to think about how you interpret the Bible. When you pick it up, what do you think you're reading? Is it the manual for life? Is it the story of God and his interaction with humankind? Is it a love letter from God? What is it? How do you interpret it? Sit there on Sunday in church service and think about how is the minister who's speaking, how are they interpreting it? If you're in a small group or Bible study group, unfortunately I don't think Rod's online tonight, so I can tell him to go and do this evening. Gee, you're spoiling my fun, Rod. If you're in a Bible study, think about how are the other people in my group this week interpreting the Bible? How are they seeing it? Be daring to ask the question. Wow, apparently we're live. Whew. So I just got the notice that Southside is now live. Yes, it's only, almost half an hour late. Good that Facebook is on the ball. We'll suddenly have everyone flooding in because we now know that we're live. I'm getting myself distracted completely, I know. So let me encourage you, think about how you interpret. Be asking yourself, how are others interpreting? And as you do that, what do you have to learn from their interpretation? And how can you present your interpretation in a way that they will be able to hear, understand, and think through? And what is the way that we're teaching our young people to interpret the Bible? And what skills are we giving them to do that? Here's a whole bunch of thoughts. Hopefully helpful, hopefully interesting, hopefully gets you thinking. Remember, if you know where he's not the Messiah, he's a naughty boy, or only true Messiah would deny that they are the Messiah, write in the box. Kylie obviously doesn't know or doesn't want to say. And you can win a prize. Isn't that wonderful? Thanks for joining us. If you've got things you'd like us to talk about in the next few weeks, pop them in the box, email me, call me, hit me across the head with them. Love to talk about what question our faithful viewers are thinking about. So thank you, faithful viewer, for tuning in again. Whether live, whether later this week, next year, next decade. Keep reading the Bible, keep exploring it, and keep discovering this wonderful God that we follow. God bless you. See you again soon.